In this presentation, Thinking About Values, Part 2, I will be covering three main areas. The first, conversation for a little bit about good before evil. And then second, a look at morals and ethics, what I call one rule to rule them all. I apologize for taking a little poetic license from J.R.R. Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings. And three, I'm going to talk about the best we can do and the best we can hope for in terms of examining values and applying principles of morality and ethics to our lives and our relationships. So, we begin by looking at the relationship between good and evil, which is the heart and soul of morality and ethics. I will begin by appealing to C.S. Lewis, the great apologist and author, scholar, and professor in the first half of the 20th century in England. Of course, you may know C.S. Lewis as the writer of the Chronicles of Narnia series, allegories based upon his faith in Christianity. But you may also be aware of him for his nonfiction works, at least some of them, most notably his work titled Mere Christianity, in which he presents his own struggles with faith and his struggles with figuring out what really does make the most sense in terms of metaphysical belief, but also in terms of morality and ethics. Other books that he produced along these lines are The Great Divorce, The Problem of Pain, and these books I would recommend to you because C.S. Lewis was authentic, he was honest, he held himself to a scrutiny that is quite impressive. He didn't provide easy, pat answers, but he took issues head on and addressed using the principles of logic, the processes of good reasoning, and evidentiary support as relevant to come to the conclusions that he came to. Now, you may not agree completely with everything Lewis said, and that's your right and your privilege, but he is worth looking at to see what he said and why he said it and how he went about it. So, C.S. Lewis made the argument that goodness precedes evil, and he illustrated this in a variety of ways. One of my favorite illustrations he used was the illustration of the crooked line. He said, how would you know if you saw a crooked line that it was in fact crooked? Well, the answer to that is as profound as it is simple. You identify a crooked line by comparing it to a straight one. You see, you must know what a straight line is and how to recognize it before you can identify a crooked one. The crooked comes after the straight. This was a brilliant analogy, I think, that Lewis used. But I think it also applies to a lot of things in life that we talk about. For example, I like to talk about light and darkness. And when I ask someone to define dark or darkness, almost 100% of the time they respond by saying, well, dark or darkness is the absence of, you guessed it, light. So I pursue that line of thinking by following with another question. So are you saying that you must have light first and you must understand what light is in order to recognize the absence of light, which we call dark or darkness? And of course, the answer to that is an affirmative. This is because light is a substance reality. Light is something that can be observed, measured. We even talk about the speed of light. Now, I know there are various theories about the speed of light not being constant, but I don't want to worry about that here. That's not really relevant to what we're saying. The point is, you can't even talk about the speed of light being constant or inconstant unless you know what light is in the first place and can, in some observable fashion, measure it. So, you begin with a substance reality. Now, when you look at dark, there's nothing to measure. Ironically and somewhat humorously, I might ask, since we know what the speed of light is, how come you never hear anyone talk about the speed of dark? Well, that's a little humorous and maybe silly, but the point is because you can't measure the speed of dark because there is no substance reality. we establish darkness by eliminating the substance reality. So therefore, light is the beginning point. Now, I would tell you, as a theologian as well as a philosopher, my background in theology, which is fairly extensive, that this is exactly what we find in both the Old and New Testaments of the Bible, where it talks about God being light, and everything then emanates from God's light, and then the absence of God or the absence of light is what came to be referred to as darkness, whether that darkness is in the empirical physical realm or in the spiritual realm. Another way of understanding this and illustrating it, I think, is to talk about health and sickness, disease, or illness. Once again, we need to look at how those two concepts interact and relate to one another. And the best way to do that is to look at the medical field and maybe talk about our own doctors. When I am not feeling well, and when I feel bad enough that I need to make an appointment with my doctor, and I go into the clinic and the doctor talks with me and runs some tests, the doctor makes a diagnosis. But now I ask you, when that happens, what is that diagnosis based upon? Well, it's not based upon illness. It's based upon health. Let me explain. My doctor diagnoses that something is wrong with me by contrasting my symptoms and conditions with what my doctor knows is optimum well-being or health. The doctor must realize in the first place how the human body is intended to function for the maximum well-being and efficiency. Therefore, health as a concept and a substance reality, because we can observe and measure how efficiently your body is functioning and draw conclusions about your well-being. Because of this, it is possible then to identify when something is not going well or isn't working right. And we call those discrepancies sickness, disease, illness. And then the doctor makes his or her diagnosis and comes up with a plan for treatment. And oftentimes the plan for treatment involves some sort of medication or a change in lifestyle, sometimes something more radical, like what happened to me with cancer surgery, which thankfully I am over now and completely cleared. So I'm very thankful for that. But the doctor doesn't just simply identify what's wrong. My cancer diagnosis came about because things were happening in my body that were not symptomatic of health and well-being. So you start with health in order to recognize illness, disease, and sickness. This is crucial because this same concept applies as an analogy to the ideas of good versus evil. Now, while good and evil are abstract concepts, they play out in the real world as substance realities that can be observed and witnessed. For example, if you had 2 glasses of clear liquid on the table in front of you, and you were told that one was pure, pristine, and healthy, and you were told the other one was laced with cyanide, but it was not detectable by sight, smell, and then you were told to pick up one glass and drink it, would it make any difference to you which glass was the pure one? And how would you identify which glass was impure? Well, you would start by understanding what pure water means. And then if something contaminates it or pollutes it, you can identify that. But most of us, and I hope you're one of this group, would never pick up one of those glasses and drink it without first getting some verification as to which one was polluted and which one was pure. So, we could say then that one glass represents health, one represents illness, sickness. We could say then one glass represents light in the sense of knowledge and understanding and wisdom, while the other glass represents darkness and its opposite. We could also say that one glass represents goodness while the other glass represents evil in terms of the actual real-world effects produced. So, I think C.S. Lewis was right when he made his argument that good comes before evil. And of course, from a theological standpoint, this is exactly, again, what the Bible says when we're told that in the beginning, God, who was the ultimate good, then created a good creation. Now, I know this raises questions about, so what happened? Because not everything is good. Did God also create the evil? Well, that's a conversation for another time. There are really good answers to that question. Again, C.S. Lewis's The Problem of Pain provides one answer, but there are other theologians, philosophers who have provided accompanying and complementary responses to that question in an impressive fashion. I'm not going to go into that here because I want to go ahead and talk about the content of the first chapter of your book and ethics. So, let's go to part 2 of our lecture. Morals and ethics, one rule to rule them all. You know, in The Lord of the Rings, there's that statement that says, one ring to rule them all. And it talks about all of the different rings that are given out to the different people, not necessarily humans, but persons, people, and races who dwell in Middle Earth. But then there's the one ring, the ring of Sauron, which is the ring which can conquer and rule all the others. Now, is the ring itself evil? Well, that's debatable. But even if the ring is not evil in and of itself, the ring has a corrupting power embedded in it, which operates on human or a person's hubris, ambition, and lust for power. And therefore, that corrupting influence turns the ring into a tool for evil. And it is, in The Lord of the Rings, it becomes the symbol of ultimate evil, that which can destroy all goodness in the world. So, one ring to rule them all. I would like for you to think about not a ring, but a rule as in a standard. Not a rule as in a law written down, but a standard by which we can judge other standards as to their benefit or their liability, as to their merit or non-merit. So, I begin by making the assertion that all truth is transcendent and universal. Anything that is called a truth, which is not transcendent and universal, is relativistic. And so in one sense it may work, granted, in another sense it may not. In one context, it may produce feelings of well-being and pleasure. In another context, it may produce quite the opposite. That's the problem with relativistic thinking and relativistic truth. Now, I don't want us to confuse relativism with dilemma. Certainly there are dilemmas we face in moral and ethical decision making, but that's not the same thing as relativistic truth. The dilemma is precisely created because truth is not relativistic. It is the universal and transcendent quality of truth that establishes a dilemma in the lives that we are currently living, where choices have to be made. And we have to sometimes struggle with what is the best choice to be made in this situation, the best choice being the choice which comes the closest to the universal transcendent truth which we are upholding. So, living life, morals and ethics, involves universal principles. Now, I would suggest to you that if there is a universal principle, there must be a universal transcendent principle giver. Because principles of morality involve sentient, sapient, volitional beings who can think, who have consciousness, and who can make choices about those things facing them. As René Descartes pointed out in his Un cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, there has to be more to it. And a lot of people don't know this, but he said there has to be an underpinning, a foundational position about morality and thinking that guides his maxim, I think therefore I am. The only way that can be established and true is if someone greater than Descartes, greater than any one of us, has created us in his image so that we can think and so that we actually do exist as beings. Descartes associated this being with what he called the superlative being of all beings, just as Anselm did with his constructs concerning the existence of God, and then Aquinas with his constructs based on ontology and teleology that accomplish the same goal. So Descartes says, I know that I can think and that I can exist because there is a superlative being who thinks and exists, who made me in this manner, made me with these capabilities. And I can know what is good and moral because the one who made me is the ultimate source of good and moral. And in fact, that being is good and moral himself. Not just that he established what goodness and morality is, but goodness and morality flows directly from his essence, nature, and being. Descartes called this perfection, the ideal of perfection. And he said always that goodness ultimately is an expression or a manifestation of the perfect, and that this superlative being is the ultimate expression of that perfection. So therefore we can know it, we can understand it, and we can strive to conform our lives to that perfection. And this is why I say, and C.S. Lewis and others make the argument that truth is universal and transcendent if it's to have any meaning at all. Now, this plays out, of course, in the creation story of the Old Testament, but also the teachings of the New Testament, but there's more to it. This involves also the idea of covenant relationship. Now, covenant relationship and contracts are not the same. Contracts are legal documents where people sign on the dotted line concerning what they are bound to do according to the written agreement. And of course, you can be taken to court and you can be charged in a civil suit for breaking the contract. Or if there are other kinds of criminal allegations, you can even end up in criminal court over that. And the contract is about holding both parties to that written agreement. But that is lesser than the idea of covenant. Covenant is not a contract agreement. Covenant is a commitment among parties that they will absolutely commit themselves to the other party, regardless of what's written on paper. For example, a covenant says that I will treat you and your loved ones, your husband, your wife, your mom, your dad, your children, I will treat them as though they are my own, and I will defend their rights just as I would my own, and I will seek for their well-being just as I would for my own and my own family. That's a covenant idea. This is what you find in the book of Exodus between Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the nation of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. You call that Sinai, but it's Sinai. And in that covenant, God, through Moses, gives the Jewish people 10 what we call commandments. But now I may shatter an illusion here for you. I'm going to tell you there's no word in Hebrew, which is what that story was originally told and written in, the Hebrew language. There is no word in that language for commandment. It doesn't exist. So that's an English translation that really has created problems in our understanding of what's really going on in that passage. Because the reality of it is that the covenant, based on the 10 commandments given in Exodus 20, really says God gave the people 10, quote, listenings. Or, another way of saying it, God gave the people 10 pieces of good advice and good counsel that would guide their lives into morality, which would then translate into health, well-being, and goodness. Well, that changes the story a little bit once you understand that. So, anyway, that's another way of thinking about it, I guess, is that morality is that which conforms to the best and highest possible counsel and advice for how to live well. But there are difficulties in making moral decisions. Of course, there are difficulties. The problem of fallenness, which we don't like to talk about too much because we want to feel like everything's swell, but then things aren't swell because horrible things happen. There's a fallenness, as Dr. Francis Schaeffer and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien talk about in their writings. A fallenness, meaning there's something that has corrupted the perfection of creation all the way from nature itself up the ladder to the highest being created, which we're told was us. That human beings created in the Imago Dei, the image of God, are the highest level of image possible. And yet there's a corruption that has entered into everything. And that corruption, we're told, was not something created by God, but it was something that was done by beings with free will and choice themselves. And what did that constitute? It constituted rebelling or rejecting the advice or the counsel that was designed to keep us safe, healthy, through presenting morality as not just a bunch of rules, but as a way of living in relationship to God, to others, to nature, so that harms disappear. That was the actual goal. Now, a way to understand this, I think, which J.R. Tolkien does a really good job of, is by presenting in the narrative, the story of the Lord of the Rings, the backstory of Gollum, that little twisted, corrupted, perverted creature who kills his cousin to possess the ring, which he calls his precious, because it was his birthday. And you deserve nice things on your birthday, so if you have to kill someone to get nice things, that's justified. Oh boy, how far are we from Lord of the Rings now? These days, in modern times, it can be frightening. But the point is, when he takes the ring into himself, the power of the ring, he begins to deform. He begins to become corrupted, perverted, so that by the time Bilbo and then Frodo encounter Gollum, he is a twisted, misshapen thing who only has a vague memory of what he was before he became contaminated. And what he was before, ironically, is similar to Frodo and Bilbo. He was a hobbit-like creature, and of course his name was Smeagol. He is no longer Smeagol, because Smeagol has disappeared, and he is now Gollum. This is illustrative of what we find in the Bible with the rebellion in heaven, the divine council, and the corruption of angels to become what we call fallen angels. But the fact of the matter is, they deform into something totally other that is absolutely evil. Hence, there's no redemption. There's no path back for them because they have lost the image of the one who made them. And so you have what we call Lucifer or Satan as the first rebel because he led the rebellion, and he becomes the ultimate example of this corruption and perversion. But notice how, as that corruption proceeds, it begins to infect everything else. Of course, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where it begins to corrupt humanity, and then it begins to corrupt the plants and the animals, and killing begins to occur, and bloodshed, and so forth, and ultimately war and murder, violence, Cain and Abel, where Cain murders his brother out of jealousy and envy. So all of these things are the result of a denial, a rebellion, and a rejection of the good advice, the good counsel that has been given concerning morality and goodness. So, if we refuse to even apply or attempt to apply transcendent universal truth to specific context, what logically can we expect to happen? Well, we will apply something lesser. And as a result, we will get outcomes that are far lower and far less than that ultimate perfection of ultimate goodness. And then we argue that this is okay. It's just not okay for someone else, but we say it's okay for us. And this does not cast us in our best light, because it starts to sound and feel somewhat hypocritical. So, one of the things we have to consider is when people engage in moral decisions and ethical behaviors, what is the intent, what is the content of their actions, and what are the logical outcomes? This is a way we have to measure all of this. and we should take it seriously and equip ourselves, for example, using some of the critical thinking tools in the Philosopher's Toolkit that I've covered already for you in class. So finally, what is the best we can do and the best we can hope for? Well, the best we can do is accept and embrace those high principles of ultimate goodness and morality, and then yield our lives to a source of power and wisdom that can guide us in our decisions. For example, if we view others as the highest image possible, just like ourselves, it becomes increasingly difficult to disparage other people and talk about them as being degraded or dirty or evil, or even talk about them to the point that they should be eradicated because they are corrupt. It's not possible to do that when we make the playing field level so that we're all the same. So the best we can do is embrace and accept those high principles that are given by the perfect one to all of us. And I might add, there's also the promise that by relying on the power of that perfect one, we actually can know what is correct, what is true, what is right, what is good, and we can actually make decisions to pursue that, follow it, and we can see outcomes that reflect that. So, this leads us to two ideas. In our lives, as we live, we must ask ourselves, how can I live so that I cause the least possible harm to myself and others? And then be honest about it and be committed to pursue what's necessary for that to happen. And not make excuses and not point our fingers at others, but to embrace it into ourselves. How might Gollum's life have been different if immediately he had owned his own bad decisions, his own evil, but instead he lies to himself and everyone else about his precious and how he deserved it and how even murder was justified? And then second, we can think about what is the greatest possible good I can do in my life, with my life, for myself and everyone else. And this, of course, these two concepts, the least harm, the greatest good, must occur in specific context. The devil is in the details, or it's in the daily moment-by-moment walk. In each moment of our lives, we have an opportunity to choose the good over the evil. Now realize, this must be based on universal transcendent principles. Otherwise, we will just lie to ourselves and in a relativistic fashion decide what we want the good to be, which is really nothing more than our own preference. It's nothing more significant, really, than saying at a ice cream shop like Brahms that you want Rocky Road ice cream because you like it, and therefore it's better because you like it than some other flavor. Mint chocolate chip, for example. But we should be better than that, and we should be more honest than that. When we're talking about morality and real life and real relationships, it should be about more than choosing a preferenced ice cream flavor. Well, we'll end the lecture here. I hope you found some things very interesting to think about. I hope that this will bless your lives as you think about your own journey in morality and ethics and your own relationships. And my hope and wish for you is that you will embrace universal and transcendent ideas of morality that can be demonstrated to be truly good, and that these will guide you in your relationships, and you will become a blessing to yourself and a blessing to all those around you. Thank you for listening to this lecture, and I'll look forward to visiting with you again soon.